Hello, everybody. My name is Vanessa de Oliveira Andreotti. I'm a professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. The University of British Columbia is located on unceded Indigenous land, and the Indigenous people here, the Musqueam, have asked all the faculty to talk about that at the beginning of every lecture to remind people that the university is located on their land. So that's where I'm speaking from, recording this video the day before the presentation at the conference. So I'm going to be talking about interculturality in teacher education in times of unprecedented planetary challenges. I have divided the presentation into three parts. The first part, I will talk about culture as a historical and systemic process, where I locate culture within a bigger picture of the division of the world according to notions of progress, development, and human evolution. And I use a metaphor to talk about that. And the second part is also about the bigger picture still, but the bigger picture of our times and how it is becoming more difficult to do intercultural work in contexts where there is more conflict. In this, we're going to look at how and why these conflicts have emerged, these global challenges have emerged, and then I will end with some insights and thoughts about teacher education in my context here in Canada. So let's start with this idea of deepening analysis. So when we talk about interculturality, it's very common to talk about culture as content. So what different cultures do, or their belief systems, or their attitudes or behavioral patterns. This is an approach to culture that seems to present culture as a noun of information that we need to acquire in order to be able to negotiate and exchange information with across cultural borders. My approach is to say that culture is always a verb that is historically, socially, it's systemically located. And in order to talk about that, I use a metaphor. So I often invite people to imagine a field of corn, to harvest their corn, and to place their corn in front of them. And then I ask if their corn cobs look like the corn cobs in the screen right now. And generally they say that their corn cobs don't look like that. In the corn cobs in their imagination are yellow. So I use the yellow corn cob as a metaphor for how our imagination has been colonized in a way and normalized one idea of what a corn cob looks like, and it's yellow. So when I talk about then culture as a verb and as multiplicity, I'm not talking just about what we don't imagine as a failure of the imagination in terms of content, but I'm talking about what we cannot imagine because we haven't been exposed to other systems that are completely different from that which we think is normal or natural. So in that sense, my work has been tracing the limits and the implication in this of the normalization of this yellow corn cob in our relationship. So how we think about what schooling looks like, what appropriate clothing looks like, what contracts, what systems of justice, relationships, romantic relationships, how religion, what we normalize as the appropriate religion, um, security, nation states, governance, health, everything. So the yellow corn cob is the water that we breathe as fish. So it's very difficult to even identify it in order to be able to trace its historical and social construction. So part of the problem here with the yellow corn cob is that it's not just about what we think and what we say, but it's also about how we feel about things and what we desire, what we hope for. And it's very easy to actually change what people think and what people say, but changing what they want, what they hope for, what they desire is much more difficult. And there is also a disconnect between these things. Sometimes we uh, think what we think we cannot say. Sometimes we don't even know that what we are desiring, because some of these desires are unconscious, right? So the problem that we have in terms of trying to interrupt the reproduction of the yellow corn cob goes beyond um, talking about things and thinking differently. It is about um, wanting something different. It's about being differently. And this is difficult because the whole of society rewards the reproduction of what is normalized. So we are, if we want to interrupt this, we're effectively asking people to interrupt the satisfaction they have with things that for them are enjoyable and rewarding and that provide security. So interrupting what society rewards is very difficult because of that. So those who actually manage to interrupt it sometimes are perceived as traitors of their culture, right? Because they are not fulfilling the expectations of society for what they should be doing. But what I want to focus on right now is that this normalization creates hierarchies. And in relation to the multicolored corn cobs, for example, you will see hierarchies that place the yellow corn cob at the top and the other corn cobs at the bottom. And you can see that the yellow corn cob then is associated with intelligence, benevolence, deservedness, cleanness, capacity, and leadership, whereas the other corn cobs are perceived as lacking, as inadequate, as ignorant, as immersed in violence and spreading violence, as helpless, and in a position of servitude, as producing waste. And this relationship then becomes um, a very fraught one, because sometimes you have the yellow corn cob wanting to help the multicolored corn cobs by painting them yellow. Sometimes you have multicolored corn cobs wanting to be yellow too. Sometimes you have multicolored corn cobs pushing back and saying, I don't want to be yellow. Just get out of my context. Don't try to change me. This hierarchy is unjust, and we want to fight for more equality here. So it's a very complex relationship, and part of my work has been to trace how this relationship manifests in education, in textbooks, in teachers' narratives, and students' narratives, or in policies. And what I've found is that there is a pattern, especially when um, yellow corn cobs want to help um, multicolored corn cobs. The relationships and representations tend to follow a pattern that I've called heads up. So heads up stands for patterns that are hegemonic, that they reinforce and justify the status quo. They do not interrupt the reproduction of the yellow corn cob. That are ethnocentric, they project one view as universal, so it's a particular view coming from the yellow corn cob. They are ahistorical, they forget historical legacies and complicities, that are depoliticized, they disregard power inequalities and ideologies. They are salvationist and self-serving. They are interested in self-congratulatory heroism, like we made a difference and things like that. They are uncomplicated. They offer feel-good, quick fixes that do not really look at the deeper analysis and systemic issues, and they are paternalistic. They wait for a thank you for whatever help or intervention has happened. And if we're going to interrupt these things, this is not just a checklist that you can go and, okay, I'm not doing this, and that. This is much more complicated, because every time you try to interrupt one thing, you, you might create another problem. And if you're trying to interrupt all of this at the same time, you probably will become unintelligible. It's like it's going to be unthinkable what you're doing for society, because they are expecting the language and grammar of the yellow corn cob. So I've written about this quite a lot, and you can find the heads up. We call it a checklist, although it's not a checklist. Um, you can find a heads up checklist if you Google it. But one thing that I have also tried to trace is how the yellow corn cob then is reproduced in education, not just as content, but as a mode of knowledge production. So I created this matrix that talks about two types of education. Education 1, think as I do, do as I say. Education 2, think for yourself and choose responsibly what to do. And then there are two types of modes of knowledge production. One that related to the yellow corn cob that says there is only one right answer and one single story of progress, development, and human evolution. And there is another one that where the mode of knowledge production says that possibilities are context dependent. So we have different ways of thinking about progress or development, and that it will depend on the context, right? So there are still right answers, but they are context dependent. It's not everything goes. So you have then A, B, C, and D. Education A, think as I do, do as I say. There's only one right answer, my way or the highway. B means there are many possibilities, but in this context, of this schooling context, you think as I do and you do as I say. Then there's C, think for yourself and choose responsibly what to do as long as you arrive at the one right answer. And D, possibilities are context dependent, and you should think for yourself and choose responsibly what to do. So we use this table to talk about the fact that it's very difficult to do D in education. Very rarely we have processes of education that are open-ended and responsible, because it can be open-ended and then every answer is a good answer and then everybody feels happy. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about processes that are actually quite uncomfortable, because they deal with uncertainty, they deal with complexities, paradoxes, contradictions, and pluralities. And this is not how our formal system of schooling has been structured through the Enlightenment. It has been structured for either A or C, or B at best. So this is interesting, because and I'm not saying here that D is where we should go, everybody just should be in D. I'm just saying that if D is missing, there is an important chunk that is not of capabilities that is not going to be developed, right? So because if you're speaking from D, you can do still A, B, and see how, depending on the context. So for example, if I had to teach you how to do CPR in 5 minutes, I'll have to use A. But I will have to forget that there are many ways actually of doing CPR, and that at the time you will have to think for yourself and choose responsibly what to do. But because I only have 5 minutes, I have to forget these things, but not forget that I have forgotten them. I would have to address them at a different point in time. So not having this discernment that D provides leaves us kind of locked in A or C. And if you have had most of your education in A or C, then that creates also affective patterns of what you expect knowledge to do and teaching to do for you in teacher education. So people who have had more A's and C's will have more difficulties working with multiple answers. We'll have more difficulties looking at complexities. We'll have more difficulties with uncertainties. We'll tend to want that fantasy of the perfect lesson plan that will work across contexts. We'll have more difficulties adapting and responding to diverse needs of students. And unfortunately, A and C are the norm, right? And we have the teacher candidates that come to us already expecting their teaching to reproduce these patterns, because that's what provides security. That's what feels familiar. That's what feels safe. That's what feels comfortable. And this becomes a problem when you want to get teachers to be more transgressive in a generative way and challenge things and try new things, take risks, and all of that. On the other hand, I'll talk a little bit about that later. As the population, the student population is also changing, the student population is pushing us to do things differently. And I think that is a very interesting thing that is happening, and it's a very interesting moment to be a teacher today, or to be a student teacher or a teacher candidate today. So this is one of the things that I wanted to put on the table. Another thing is this other, we call it a social cartography. It's a map. This is a map of disposition for crossing borders that we use with teacher educators and student teachers here. It emerged in Finland, actually, when I was working there with Simo, as a way to assess dispositions of people who went on Erasmus programs, and then it developed into a tool for teacher education as well. So it talks about 4 dispositions of crossing borders. There's the first disposition is the house, the fenced house, where you don't want to cross any border, you just want to stay in the house because you perceive an external threat beyond the fences and you just want to stay put. The threat can be real or not real, but there is the perception of a threat. The second disposition is where you want to cross borders on your RV, like in a caravan, and you want to look at the world through the comforts of your home. So you're keeping your cognitive reference, you're just looking at things through the window, and the window is reflecting back to you more of yourself than it is reflecting of what it feels like to be on the other side of the border. The next disposition is where you get off the RV and you put your tent up and you feel that you're very open. You're already in the space and you are on the ground in a different land, but you keep the door of the tent open, but you only allow within the tent what fits the tent, right? So, and what is convenient too. So you don't want any dirty shoes or any mosquitoes within your tent, but it feels very open. But in effect, it's open only to selective things. And then you have the last disposition, which is the straw hat. So you have to imagine a naked person under the straw hat and open to the sun and the rain. And this straw hat protects to a certain extent, but it is also precarious, right? It will have to be rewoven at some point because straw doesn't last very long. So these are all metaphors for our relationship with knowledge and how we use knowledge as in the mediation of our relationships. So in the house, it's a very thick wall. The RV, it's thinner but still contained. The tent is much more flexible, but with the hat, you don't have much to rely on. You have thinned that relationship and you are much more open to be interpolated and to learn from what's in your context. And when we talk about crossing borders, they can be intellectual borders, geographical borders, emotional borders, cultural borders, all kinds of borders. And what we say is that we bring all of these dispositions with us in any context. And depending on what happens, you're going to be either in the tent, in the house, with the hat, or with the in the RV. But we also use it to talk about the fact that in schooling processes, like it's very common to see the RV being strengthened and developed more, much more than the tent, right? So the tent is when intercultural education is being done in a way that really makes people more permeable to taking the risk of really trying to learn from a different context. But very, very rarely we have the disposition of the hat being encouraged in schools. And this is because in schools, our relationship with knowledge is a thicker relationship, right? You want a lot from knowledge, and you want to create things from knowledge. Whereas with the hat, it's a position more of openness to the undefinability and the plurality of the world that is not encouraged in formal education processes in the West. So we're trying to talk about the fact that we actually need more processes that encourage this openness to plurality, which would go more with the D kind of education that I presented before. But it is a more challenging type of education because it requires both criticality and openness. And we've been talking in my research collective about this idea of digging deeper. You would be focused on digging deeper and relating wider. So you have the intellectual accountability for the historical and systemic processes that have created the world in a certain way and power relationships in a certain way, at the same time that you're also open to relating in ways that can move these relationships, and you have the skills to be vulnerable and allow yourself to be changed in these processes, right? And we are advocating for that, for the inclusion of this kind of disposition into our repertoire, because we will need them in order to address the global challenges we will need to address together, which is the next topic. So we're going to just go back briefly to the yellow corn cob and put the yellow corn cob in context, which we will call a house. So this is the house of modernity that normalizes the yellow corn cob and the single story of progress, development, and human evolution. And the stability of this house is dependent on historical, political, economic, and social ecological factors. So what we're going to be doing in these slides is trying to trace what sustains the conditions for this worldview to have stability. So this house was created and is maintained by resource extraction, by human exploitation, by unfair trade, by unjust debt, by militarization, and by cognitive and cultural imperialism. So we cannot really turn our back to the violences that have created and maintained the house, right? And the fact that for us to have everything we have, there is expropriation and exploitation happening somewhere else. And this is part of the historical and systemic conditions of keeping this house secure. Now, the house now is balancing, and we have a situation where overconsumption, precarious employment, ecological disasters, climate change, violent conflict, mass migration, condition of hyper-individualism, a disconnect between people, wealth disparities, compromised democracy, and austerity are creating a lot of a sense of unsustainability and insecurity within the house. And this is causing fractures where uh, the worldview of the yellow corn cob is starting to crack. And this is causing, of course, confusion, fear, sense of scarcity, disaffection, lots of boredom, impotence, anxiety, depression, self-harm. Reactive and simplistic solutions are coming up. There's a lot of fragility, a lot of resentment, scapegoating, anger, and hate. So there is a sense of an inability to face the magnitude of the problems that we have to face together. And this is why I think we have been advocating for a different kind of education that we could call intercultural education, where we could have difficult conversations without relationships falling apart. And it is a very interesting moment because maybe, like in Brazil, we have this proverb about floods, and it says that in flood situations, it's only when the water reaches your bum that you can't actually swim. Before that, you can only walk in the water, right? So I think the waters are rising, and the kind of interculturality we will need is not just for um, nice exchanges or business, really. It will be about negotiating the terms of our existence on this planet. And it will require that we clear our traumas, that we compost our individual and collective traumas together. And that's a very difficult conversation and a very a very different form of engagement than just teaching about what each culture does differently, right? Or how each culture can adapt to a specific society. This will be a much more challenging kind of conversation that will require different types of affective investments. So, in that sense, my job as an educator, if I know that the waters are rising and this is coming, would be to focus my efforts on preparing people to sit in discomfort together and to map how we haven't been able to do that um, because of the conditions that we have within the House of Modernity. So there's a lot of work that is being done in that area. There is a collective called Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures that if you Google, you will find some of the work there. There's recently a booklet that was published called Global Citizenship Education Otherwise that explains the rationale for this kind of work. That is also on the website. It's decolonialfutures.net/GCE. And we're trying different things to see how we can open the possibility of a different kind of existence as we face the unprecedented crisis, and what kinds of capabilities and skills are going to be necessary for us to do that together. So the ability, for example, to face and sit with complexity, with uncertainty, with a plurality of perspectives, the ability to face paradoxes and contradictions without being overwhelmed by that. The ability to sense very differently, to work with the body very differently, is also part of the process. How we relate to knowledge, as I mentioned before, this way of using knowledge and expecting knowledge to do what it can do and not more, but trying to relate beyond identity knowledge and understanding is also part of the process. And we are carrying out lots of pedagogical experiments in relation to that. Some of them are with educators, some of them are with artists and activists. Um, yeah, that's what we've been doing. And a set of questions have become very important in preparing people to sit together in discomfort. And I'm just gonna finish with that. We're using them in Canada here with teacher educators as well. So they involve questions like what perceptions, projections, desires, and expectations inform what you're doing or thinking, and how do these things affect your relationships? What cultural ignorances do you continue to embody, and what social tensions are you failing to recognize in a specific context? What's preventing you from being present and listening deeply without fear, judgment, and projections? What problems do your solutions reproduce or generate? What do you need to give up or let go of in order to go deeper? What truths are you not ready, willing, or able to speak or to hear? How can we respect the pace and readiness of your learning while being accountable to those negatively affected by this learning and its pace? How can we distinguish between distractions and important stuff? And how do we know when we are stuck? So, as I said before, like trying to find ways to direct learning towards more discernment, more disarmament, and this decentering of the ego is what we're looking after here. How we can declutter our existence so that we can actually um, sit together in ways that open different possibilities for the future is where I think this work is interested in going. And I hope that this can be useful for the context of the participants in the conference. I look forward to having a conversation with you about that. I will be available on Skype as soon as we finish this video. Thank you very much.